Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. This is Vicki Healy at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Welcome to today's webinar on the energy transition and the role of women series. Where do we stand today? And we'll begin our presentations now. One second while I transfer. Okay. So real quickly, I will go over the agenda. This morning or today, wherever you are, we will be starting with a few welcome remarks and going over a few housekeeping items. The second part of our agenda will be just a quick overview on GWNET and the Clean Energy Solutions Center, and we'll provide introductions to our panelists. Following the introductions, our panelists will be presenting, and we are very fortunate and happy to have today Rana Adib from REN 21, Celia Garcia, Associate Program Officer at Irena, and Minoru Takada from UNDESA. Following the panelist presentations, we will have a moderated question and answer session, and we're very happy to have Christine Lenz, Executive Director at GWNET, moderating our Q&A session today. Real quickly, for all of our participants, you have two options to listen into this webinar. The first option is to use your computer by selecting the mic and speakers function. There's a little radio button on the right-hand side of your screen that will display this option. The other way you may listen in is to use your telephone, and you can do this by selecting the telephone option in the right-hand display, and a phone number and a PIN will display so that you can dial in and listen in by phone. And again, just a gentle reminder to our panelists that while you're not speaking, if you could remain on mute so that we aren't hearing any sort of background noise and things of that nature. A little more housekeeping. If you have a question, as I mentioned, we will have a moderated question and answer session following the presentations. If you'll look to the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a questions pane. And if you'd like to ask a question, please just type in your question into that box, and we'll be able to see that, and we will be addressing the audience questions. Also, just to let you know, we are recording today's session. So after the webinar is completed, we will email a link to you of the recording of this webinar. It may take a day or two, but we will be sending that link out. And then also we will be posting the recordings to the Clean Energy Solutions Center's website, where you'll be able to access this presentation and others that you might want to listen to. We also have a YouTube channel, so we will be posting the webinar recording also to the YouTube channel. And both of the links for the training page and the YouTube channel are listed here on this slide. Real quickly, just to give you an overview of our two co-hosts today, GWNET and the Clean Energy Solutions Center. So first, the GWNET aims to advance the global energy transition by connecting and empowering women working in sustainable energy in both developed and emerging developing countries. And this is done through networking, where to basically work towards connecting women together with similar interests, also through advocacy, generating and sharing information, and also through their services, the mentoring, coaching, and consulting services that they offer. The Clean Energy Solutions Center is a multilateral initiative, which is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. And the Clean Energy Solutions Center is co-led by the Australian government and also the U.S. government. The Solution Center was designed to support the transition of clean energy markets and technologies, and this is done by providing technical assistance to governments in regions all around the world with helping to strengthen clean energy policies and finance measures. This technical assistance is designed and structured so that we can respond quickly, and the service is offered free of charge. Also, we provide capacity building activities through online training programs and also webinars like the one you're listening to today. To date, the Solution Center has responded to over 450 requests for assistance from over 90 countries. And with that, I will now turn over the webinar to Christine Lenz to introduce our speakers today. Christine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and good morning, good afternoon, dear listeners. We are happy that so many of you followed our invitation to join what is the first webinar in a series, webinar series that Clean Energy Solution Center and GWNET are launching on gender equality for a more rapid and inclusive energy transition. It is the first, I think, that we organize in this constellation a series of webinars which will explore the current role of women in the sector, detail opportunities in this sector, hear from successful women in the field, highlight best practices and policy options, and networks to foster gender equality in the transition to sustainable energy. In each webinar, panel experts will be followed by an interactive Q&A session with the audience. And as Vicky has mentioned, please type in your questions in the chat function should you have some, and should any arise during the presentations. We will then all answer them at the end. Today's webinar is composed of 3 speakers. We are focusing on the subject of energy transition and the role of women. Where do we stand today? So our first speaker, Rana Adib, who is Executive Secretary of REN21, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century, which is a public-private multi-stakeholder network on renewable energy headquartered at the United Nations Environment Programme in Paris, France. She will be telling us a little bit about the state of the energy transition globally based on the latest findings of REN21's Renewables Global Status Report that was launched earlier this year. Our next presenter, Celia Garcia from Irena. Celia works as Associate Program Officer at Irena in Abu Dhabi, where she works in the Knowledge Policy and Finance Center, and she will present some of the main findings of Irena's study, Renewable Energy Agenda Perspective, that was released in January 2019, giving us some insights about the role of women in this sector and what the key findings from this study are. And last but not least, we will hear from Minoru Takada, who is team leader on sustainable energy at the Division for Sustainable Development Goals at UNDESA, the United Nations United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And Minoru will, on the one hand, tell us a little bit about SE4All's tracking report. So he will tell us on how we stand, where we stand on the implementation of SDG 7 on energy. And I guess he will probably also make a link to some other SDGs, such as SDG 5 on gender equality. And with this, we hope to give you quite some concise overview about the topic, and then open the floor for all your questions. Without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Rana for her presentation on the status of the global energy transition, with a particular focus on the role of renewables. Over to you, Rana.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you very much to the Clean Energy Solution Center and GWNET for inviting us to this webinar. Hello, everybody. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'll give you a quick overview on where we stand today when it comes to renewable energy and the energy transition. So very quickly, who is REN21? So we have an awfully long name, the Renewable Energy Policy Network of the 21st Century. What we are is basically a group of players coming together to build a sustainable energy future with renewable energy. These players can be individuals and organizations coming from governments, intergovernmental organizations, industry associations, NGO, and research and academia. And this multi-stakeholder space is really Rent21's DNA, because it is a very collaborative approach. There is an expert community which is participating in all our activities, and we speak about ourselves very much as a coalition of the willing to advance basically and accelerate the transition quickly. We do produce knowledge products like the Renewables Global Status Report, Regional Report, the Cities Report, but also we have a series on the futures, which is more addressing perceptual challenges which still exist. And we do not use this knowledge only because we're data crunchers. This is not so much what we are, but really to inform decision makers and shape the debates. And shaping the debates we, for instance, do in the International Renewable Energy Conference series, and the next edition will take place actually next week. So in Korea, and hosted by the Korean government and the municipality of Seoul. So I hope that some of the players on the line will be able to join us there. Now, when we're looking at 2018, where do things stand? It was, again, another strong year for renewable energy. That's clearly a reality, because why is this a reality? It's because renewable energy today is a mainstream technology. And this is the result of, is basically the result of low cost, in particular in solar photovoltaics and in wind power. Here you will see, for instance, over the last 10 years, the development of solar photovoltaic capacity additions. We clearly see that there is an exponential development here, and there are continuous technology advancements and cost reductions. And I think what is really interesting is that today, basically solar PV, for instance, is not spread in some pioneering countries only, but in over 100 countries, we do have significant markets. Now, yes, we do have very clearly a strong year, and in particular in the power sector, you see this here, there are developments. But unfortunately, 2018 also showed that we are not reaching the goals in terms of accelerating renewable energy deployment when it comes to reaching the Paris Agreement, but also the SDGs. So you see that between 2017 and 2018, the curve has basically been stagnating. And this is something which is not a good news, I guess, on the 2018 development. This is also something which is reflected in the investment. So here you have the curve of global new investment in renewable power and fuels. And you see that the curve is going down, actually. There is a drop, a decrease of over 11% from 2017 to 2018. And there are two reasons for it. One reason is that cost reductions have really materialized also throughout the year, which means that for €1 you will receive higher installed capacities. The other part is, however, that there have been policy and regulatory frameworks in China have been reviewed and adapted to also reflect these costs. And this is right away reflected in the installed capacities, in particular in China, which have dropped from $146 almost billion to $91.2 billion. Now, when we're looking at 2018, I guess there is another challenging situation here, which is we do see that renewable power is really driving very much renewable energy development. And in the power sector, we have a share of renewable energy of 26%. However, electricity only represents 17% of the total final energy demand. So over 80% of the energy demand takes place for heating, cooling, and transport. And here we have a renewable share in the heating and cooling sector of 10% only, and in transport sector of 3% only. So this is quite a challenging situation. And the message here is clearly we need to replicate this great story of renewables which took place in the power sector in these other end-use sectors. Now, this development is obviously very much the result of policy and regulatory frameworks. And you clearly see, so on the blue curve, here you have the power regulator policies. 135 countries in 2018 had power regulator policies. And you clearly see there is a steep increase from 2004. When we're looking into transport, it's only 70 countries, and most of this is biofuel blending mandates. And in the heating and cooling sector, it's even worse. It's only 20 countries, and actually from 2017 to 2018, this dropped. Now, admittedly, there is 44 countries that have carbon pricing policies, and these are quite important when we're looking into the heating sector. So what can we conclude here? We can conclude that the policy and regulatory frameworks are key to shape the right market conditions. And if we're really serious about Paris and if we're serious about the SDGs, it means that we also need to address the development of renewable energy in the heating, cooling, and the transport sector. And here comes one of the parameters which is fundamental to address if we want to make this happen. Transport, heating and cooling rely heavily on fossil fuel, and renewable energy is globally still not operating in a level playing field. So this map illustrates the fossil fuel subsidies, and they are still widespread. And in 2017, they reached $300 billion US. According to the latest IEA numbers, this has even increased by 30% when we're looking at 2018 numbers. And when we're looking at these subsidies, they do not comprise the external cost of fossil fuel. So it's clear that fossil fuel subsidies need to be phased out. Another aspect also when we're looking at the numbers is, especially when we're looking at heating, cooling, and transport, that we're talking about markets which are very, especially in the heating and cooling sector, which are very local markets. So the reality is that there is not very good consolidated data on renewable energy heating and cooling. And this is the reason why Renewable has started to work on a new report series, and the Renewables in Cities Global Status report will be launched in November, the first edition. Because these are local markets, and we also see that cities play a major role in advancing the transition. And there is 65% of global energy demand taking place in cities. Cities account also for 75% of the global CO2 emissions. And this report allows to really better understand what the role of cities really is, what policies and regulatory frameworks are driving renewable energy, but will also, at least this is what we're looking for, improve the data situation in the heating and the cooling sector. What we can say here from the cities report, and I think it's something which is really important to take into account, especially considering the discussion we're having here, also on the role of women, on the role of renewable energy, not only for climate change, but also in reaching the SDGs, is that very clearly the drivers for renewable energy are plenty. It's not only climate change, it's about cost reductions, it's about job creation, it's about addressing air pollution, about energy security. And that's actually something which is important, I think, if we want to accelerate the transition, is to keep this in mind, because it is fundamental to make renewable energy relevant to the different decision makers. I will not go into details on top because I think that these are Irena numbers. Irena will probably highlight these. So I'm coming to my concluding slides. I think is, even though I had quite critical views on 2018, it is important to keep in mind that the transition is possible and that there are positive examples showing us the way. One is very clearly what has happened in the power sector can be replicated in other sectors, provided there is the policy attention. There is leadership from some national governments which are paving the way towards 100% renewable energy. Cities and subnational governments are setting quite ambitious targets, often even more ambitious than the national governments. So these are players who can really be fundamental in driving the transition. And we also see that over 1,000 organizations totaling $8 trillion USD managed assets have committed to divest from fossil fuel. also acknowledging basically the risk linked to fossil fuel. The private sector has doubled its investment in sourcing renewable power. And that's also interesting to keep in mind. This private sector is on the energy consuming side. So I think today it's really fundamental to bring renewable energy, not only from the generation side, but bridge to the energy consuming sector. I would just like to remind this disconnect when we're looking at the sectors. There is still a conflation between renewable electricity and renewable energy, which is taking place in the debate. It's very important that we clarify this and that we address the transition all over. And when you're looking at the imbalance on the lower part, it is clear that we need to align policies here, strengthen policies, phase out fossil fuel if we're very serious, and obviously build on the twin pillars, which are efficiency to reduce the energy demand and renewable energy to cover this, the remaining energy demand with renewable energy. One other last point, because we hear this very much in the policy debate, it's about changing perceptions. And I think that's also something where there is a parallel between renewable energy and women, for instance, in leadership positions. For changing perception, it is important to make the new reality the norm of today, or the normal of today. And I think that's something where policy and regulatory frameworks can also be one of the drivers, in addition to information and awareness raising. I'm coming to my end, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rana, for this very concise overview on the status of renewables and also the status of the transition in different sectors, such as the city field. I can assure you that REN21's Renewables Global Status Report has much more information than what Rana what Rana presented in a nutshell. So I encourage you to look up REN21's website, where you can download the report, infographics, and many more things free of charge. I also encourage you to type in your questions to Rana on the transition, which has really over the last decades become a global phenomenon in the chat function. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Celia, who will complement this first presentation by focusing on the status of women in renewable energy. Over to you, Celia.
Thank you very much, first of all, for organizing, and second, for extending the invitation. It's my pleasure to have this opportunity to present some of the findings of Irena's report on renewable energy, a gender perspective. For those listening who may not be familiar with Irena from before, Irena is an intergovernmental organization, and since its inception in 2011, Irena's mandate is to promote the energy transformation and the adoption of all forms of renewable energy worldwide. And actually, since then, the energy sector is witnessing transformative changes towards more renewable, distributed, and decarbonized systems. These developments entail valuable socioeconomic benefits, including jobs, along the different segments of the renewable energy value chains. And in fact, as Rana already predicted, I'm going to discuss a little bit first the jobs numbers, because at Irena, we analyzed the global employment in renewable energy since 2013, covering methodological issues, discussing policies in support of job creation, assessing skills and training, and exploring gender aspects. We generate yearly estimates of global employment. The latest edition of our Renewable Energy and Jobs Annual Review finds that the number of jobs in renewable energy worldwide expanded from 10.3 million jobs in 2017 to 11 million people in 2018. And even though the energy transition is still unfolding, the number of jobs in renewable is already substantial compared to the roughly 30 million jobs in the fossil fuel sector. The balance of employment will continue to shift away from fossil fuels to renewables, reaching up to 42 million jobs in 2050 in the renewable energy sector, according to our latest analysis. As the ongoing energy transformation accelerates, we need to ensure that the benefits, such as employment creations, are broadly accessible and equitably distributed. An important step in this direction is taking a closer look at gender. Us, women, represent about half of the humanity. Yet, we have traditionally been underrepresented in the workforce, and especially in the energy sector. According to our global survey, which entails responses over 1,500 women, men, and organizations working in the renewable energy sector, and that we presented in the Irena's report, Renewable Energy, a Gender Perspective, women represent 32% of the renewable energy workforce. This is doing much better than the broader conventional energy sector, which accounts for around 22%, but still worse than the overall economy, which is 44% approximately. As in other sectors, women's participation is much lower in STEM jobs, those that are related to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and in the non-STEM technical jobs, which account for 35% of the share, compared to the administrative jobs, which account for 45% of the total. So, like in other fields of work, women still encounter numerous obstacles. So, regarding barriers to entry, it is interesting to note that only 40% of the men respondents to the survey, which included also decision makers, perceived the existence of gender-related barriers in the sector, compared to 75% of women who actually acknowledge that there are barriers for women to entry. According to the survey, perception of gender roles are seen as the most important barrier, which are driven by cultural and social norms that influence many of the fundamental decisions people make. In addition, women continue to have limited presence in the sector due to the lack of adequate awareness about STEM and non-STEM career paths in renewable energy sector. Professional and personal networks are critical for entering and succeeding in many professions, but women have had more difficulty accessing such networks. When it comes to barriers to retention and advancement, the survey found that the glass ceiling is the most important barrier. In almost half of the participating private sector firms, men represented at least 75% of board members. Other barriers relate to mobility requirements and difficult work schedules that are very demanding for women shouldering family and household duties. Wage inequities were also flagged as an issue. Close to 2/3 of the survey respondents believed that women in renewables earn less than men in the same position. Other factors include the lack of supportive environment, as for example, lack of flexible work hours, lack of family-friendly measures, mentoring, networking, training opportunities, and gender equity in general. So for that, there are some measures to improve gender balance that depend on specific circumstances. The report suggests a range of promising solutions. First of all, mainstreaming gender perspective through audits and awareness trainings that can change broad perceptions as well as specific workplace practices. For example, gender audits of the energy sector policy have been implemented in several developing countries through support such as Energia, the international network on gender and sustainable energy. It's also important to level in the playing field for both genders, which can be achieved by creating supportive networks and mentorship arrangements for women. One example is the online programs developed by GWNET, which is very important for mentoring, or recognition of women's accomplishments through awards such as WAR Woman of the Year. It's also critical to improve access to adequate education and training opportunities through adjustments in curricular, targeted scholarship, and internship. Some examples include, for example, MIT or King's College London that adapted their curriculum to attract more women, and they succeed. It's also possible to introduce gender targets and quotas to address workplace imbalances. Like, for example, Engineers Canada adopted the 30 by 30 program to raise the number of newly licensed female engineers to 30% by 2030. Or other countries that do actually have mandatory quotas for corporate boardrooms, which, for example, include France, Germany, Norway, which resulted in higher shares of women. Other possible thing is committing the leadership to ensure workplace policies and practices, such as first, fair and transparent decision-making and equal pay, to reduce the gender pay gap. This is something, for example, that Iceland, the public utility in Reykjavik Energy adopted policies. Energy Australia raised women's salaries in 2018 to achieve pay parity with men, which accounted almost for $1 million for 300 women. And last but not least, introducing greater flexibility in work arrangements. In the survey, part-time employment and flexi-time arrangements were among the most favored options among survey respondents, together with adequate parental leave policies. In terms of the access context, in areas where energy access is still being established or expanded, the most common barrier cited was cultural and social norms, followed by lack of gender-sensitive policies, training opportunities, and inequity in asset ownership. It's interesting to see that the cultural and social norms was the barrier selected more often by respondents in Europe and in North America, while respondents from other regions were much more likely to select the lack of the skills and training as an important barrier. In conclusion, to advance the gender equality in renewable energy sector, it's essential to adopt some measures that include mainstreaming gender in the energy sector frameworks at all levels. Gathering and reporting gender disaggregated data is crucial. And also, of course, mainstreaming gender through audits and awareness training, as I already mentioned. It is important to mention that mainstreaming gender should also be done in the energy access projects, programs, and policies. The socioeconomic dividends of gender mainstreaming in the access context are huge, and for such, it is critical to pay special attention in that context. Improving access to adequate education and training opportunities. As mentioned before, there is a need to adapt curriculum and strengthen mentorship for women, tailoring training and skills development in technical and not technical subjects, both for the modern and the access context. Creating supportive networks and mentorship arrangements for women, such as the GWNET program, it is critical to help advance gender equality in the workplace. Attracting and retaining talent in the sector through policies such as gender quotas and conducive working environments, which include measures like to facilitate part-time employment, flexi-time arrangements, adequate paid parental policies. That way we will address workplace imbalances. In addition, committing the leadership to ensure workplace policies in practice, such as fair and transparent decision-making and equal pay, is key. In the access context, access to finance and markets are key, with programs providing loans for women in off-grid communities, for example. And last but not least, again, challenging cultural and social norms to strengthen the visibility of women in the energy transition and help women become agents of social and economic transformation. Removing restricting laws, institutional barriers, and discriminatory cultural practices is a must. As Rana mentioned, using policies and regulations to change the perceptions of the gender roles. In conclusion, advancing equality and diversity in the energy sector is a compelling proposition rather than a zero-sum game. Establishing gender as a pillar of energy strategies at the national and global levels will produce a swifter and more inclusive transition to renewable energy, while accelerating the attainment of multiple sustainable development goals. To finalize, I would like to mention that Irena, in collaboration with GWNET and GWNET, is currently analyzing the role of women in the wind sector. We are conducting a survey as a first effort to track women's presence across the full value chain of the wind sector, participation in technical versus not technical roles, and the access to gender inclusive policies and perception of gender bias. The survey can be accessed online, and it's available in English, Spanish, and Mandarin. The results will serve as the basis of the new report that will be launched in January 2020. And I would like to kindly encourage all organizations and individuals in the wind sector to participate, and if possible to our attendees to promote this initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celia, for highlighting the importance of creating more gender balance for this energy transition. You have seen the impressive numbers. We have 11 million people working in the sector globally today, with a share of 32% of women, and this number is supposed to go up significantly in the years to come. So I think that the achieving a more balanced energy transition and more women in this sector will be a prerequisite for making sure that the energy transition is advancing as quickly as we need it. And there is still a long way to go to ensure sustainable energy access for all. And this is, I think, already the segue to our next speaker. And we are very honored to have a man on the panel, because Very often the gender topic is put in the women's corner, but I think it's important that this is addressed by both men and women, because we also need men as agents for change to really change the situation. And with this, I'll hand over the floor to one of those champions, Minoru Takada, to provide us his insights on SDG 7 and where we stand at the moment, and his insights on the linkage between the different SDGs. Over to you, Minoru.
Thank you, Christine. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I talk a little bit about SDG 7 situation and come to the gender issues in the next step. SDG 7, as you know, are composed of the three main targets related to energy access, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. Now, the situation right now, 4 years after the 2015 SDGs establishment, is that progress toward SDG 7 is a mixed bag. Good news is that electrification is progressing much faster than it used to be before 2015. As you can see that, right now there are still 840 million people without electricity, but this is quite declining rapidly, thanks to the technological advancements such as decentralized renewable energy options. And some of the countries such as India is going progressively and aggressively electrifying the entire population. Also, renewable energy, power sector, you can see that lots of sort of new technologies, new deployments going on. On the other hand, there are some areas which are not progressing sufficiently on the clean cooking. Access to clean cooking, which is also one of the important sort of objective under SDG 7, it's not progressing well. Still, there are 3 billion people in the world who are burning traditional on the solid fuels. And also energy efficiency, we're supposed to double the rate of improvement in energy efficiency by 2030, but we are not going in that direction. Right now, it's about 2.3% per year improvement compared with what we need, which is about 2.7% annual improvement going forward. Broadly, financing for SDG 7 targets to achieve the SDG 7 targets by 2030 is roughly half of what we need. It is estimated about $1.4 trillion per year is going to be required, while we have about $600–700 billion going into that area. So we're seeing some mixed bag. Now, what do we see in terms of gender implications here? Let me pick up a few points here. Number one, I mentioned that there are 3 billion people who are still cooking with the traditional, biomass stoves and another sort of polluting fuels. That is causing about 3.8 million premature deaths annually, according to WHO, and the majority of them are women. So you can see the significant impacts here in one dimension related to gender. 18 hours per week is being spent by women in sub-Saharan Africa, according to one study, if you do not have access to clean cooking. And compared with, say, 5 hours per week, the women are spending for that purposes when clean cooking solutions are available at home. Education, about 230 million people are without the electricity at primary school. And this is negatively affecting both boys and girls, but I think, often the burden falls also on girls, because there are so many girls who are forced to be working outside. And then because of the sort of lack of access to the modern facilities, they are disproportionately burdened by this situation. Jobs and empowerment, the leadership position, let's say in the ministerial positions or vice ministerial positions, there are about less than 10% of ministers and vice ministers who are making an energy decision in the world. And we have heard a little bit sort of encouraging signs from the renewable energy sector in terms of women's workforces. But broadly speaking, right now, about a quarter of the workforce in the energy sector are women. So, and when it comes to boardroom decision making, it's much less. So you can see that, you know, there are a lot to be done to make sure the women's voices are going to be reflected in the energy decision making and also implementation. So what are the areas that we have to work on, and what are sort of priority actions moving forward? Number one, clearly, gender issue would have to be taken into consideration in any programmatic and also policy decision-making processes across the board. This is something that I think, you know, everybody is aware of and often talk about, but I think there are a lot to be done here. Second, specific sort of areas of interventions, particularly clean cooking, that we have to give much more higher priority. Now, luckily that, you know, there are organizations and countries who are standing up. In 2018, UN had the first review of SDG 7 at high-level political forum. Ministerial declaration identified clean cooking solutions as a top priority. Accordingly, international organizations started working on this one. And just this September at the Climate Action Summit, Secretary General, in September here in New York, there was establishment of Clean Cooking Fund by the World Bank of the order of $500 million, supported by Health and Energy Global Platform of Action, established by the number of UN organizations to support it. So I think there's a specific actions emerging, and also some of the governments started putting clean cooking as a top priority. So we are seeing an encouraging sign, but we need more of those things. Thirdly, data. We have to disaggregate many of the sort of, you know, action that we're doing, and the analysis we have to keep a bit more disaggregated than analysis. One of the, you know, one of the initiatives that, you know, the international organization is doing is called the Multi-Tier Framework for Energy Access. This is giving a more disaggregated data set, try to identify specific sort of situation with regard to access to electricity and access to clean cooking. While this is not right now disaggregated, we're hoping that this is going to give a much more sort of precise answers to where people are with regard to the situation of access, and be able to give a bit more sort of, you know, the situation-specific solutions that will also better address the status of women and needs of women moving forward. At the United Nations, we're going to take up the gender issues with regard to energy even stronger than we were doing so far. Next 10 years, Secretary General identified next 10 years as SDG action decade. So we are going to make sure gender is going to be at the center of every effort, including when we are going to push SDG 7. High-level political forum, which is the annual gathering at the United Nations to review the progress toward SDGs. We are going to see in the couple of years down the line in a second review of SDG 7. We look forward to having this specific sort of issue related to gender and energy as a focus. And thirdly, at the climate change sort of discussions, the annual discussion at the COP, we are going to see more and more discussion in relation to climate change and gender. And this issue cannot be discussed without, you know, discussion on clean energy and empowerment of women within that. So we also look forward to having a stronger discussion and advocacy effort in it. United Nations here, we will be working together with, you know, the key UN organizations, others such as World Bank, IEA, Irena, and others, to continue to document the progress toward SDGs by issuing annual SDG 7 tracking report. And also to complement, we are also assembling what we call SDG 7 policy brief, which also discusses and analyzes the linkages between SDG 7 and all 17 SDGs moving forward. So we look forward to sharing those information annually and continue to have this dialogue moving forward. Thank you very much, Christine. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Minoru, for this very concise viewpoint on where we stand on SDG 7, also by outlining the quite many challenges that that we have ahead of us in really ensuring we reach sustainable energy for all in the decade to come. There were some questions about Minoru's presentation. He didn't share any slides, but in the webinar invitation, you got links to all 3 reports that were discussed today, the Renewables Global Status Report, the Irena report, Renewable Energy Agenda Perspective, and also the SDG 7 Tracking Report. So you will find information there. Thanks a lot for everybody who has typed in their questions. I'm going to go through those right now, and I'll start with a question for Rana. What factors do you think that have influenced the greater increase in renewable energy sharing in the power sector when compared to heating, cooling, and transport sectors? And what are the main challenges to foster the transition to renewable energy?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I think when it really comes to, when we're looking at the parameters which have driven the renewable energy uptake in power, there is very clearly, the start is political will, and being ready to having the courage of having a vision and trying to align and bring together the different players to make this vision a reality. And I think here we had some pioneering countries, also in Germany very much with the 100,000 rooftop program, where the idea was really to develop renewable energy, but also to deploy basically with targets and specific policies to develop a renewable energy industry. And this is something which is fundamental, because you need this public-private collaboration to then develop technologies, technology innovation, bring down costs, but accompany these developments by setting the right market conditions. And I think this is really something where today we can say, if we want to replicate it in other sectors, political leadership is needed, and this means having the vision, bringing the players together, setting targets, and creating the right policy frameworks. Now, what are the biggest challenges today to accelerate the transition? I think there is lots of good things happening, and also in the heating, cooling, and transport sector, actually. But what is needed is really to accelerate it and create overall market conditions which globally, but then obviously at the regional level and the national level, which allow for renewable energy to really that the energy systems can build on the advantages of renewable energy. And the first approach here is to create a level playing field. And this is where it becomes quite challenging, I guess, when we're talking about the transition. There is still an economy which is very much defined, and an energy system which is very much defined by fossil fuel infrastructure, players, and investment. And in this transition, the right policy framework, or basically this transition, needs to be accompanied very much by policies to move from a fossil fuel centered energy system to a renewable energy system, or energy efficiency and renewable energy system. So it's also very clear that for some of the aspects we don't have the answers yet. We will also discover by advancing the transition very much in the heating and the transport sector, for instance. But policies, courage, targets, and public-private approach is fundamental.
Thanks a lot, Rana. You also mentioned in your presentation that the data situation is crucial, as it is a starting point in any policy field. The next question, I think, goes maybe to yourself, but also to Celia. Do we have information on the number of countries with regulatory frameworks on gender mainstreaming of the energy sector in particular?
So Celia, I guess since it's gender related, so from Rent on one side, we're very, very happy that this topic is being pushed. We're also trying to support this in tapping into our community, but we don't have consolidated data yet from Rent on one side. But Celia, I think you probably have some other information.
Yeah, likewise. We don't have a consolidated data on that regard, but some anecdotal experiences that we are accounting. For example, the Rwanda government, they have policies to mainstream gender in all the access energy context. There are some other initiatives in Latin America. Chile has a target to try to include more women in the sector. There are some other examples, as I mentioned, in terms of quotas, like France, Norway, and other countries. Reykjavik, like Iceland, is working very hard in terms of the gender pay gap to eliminate it and adopting policies towards that goal. Likewise, in Australia, they try to implement some policies in order to decrease the women's salaries differentiation among men. But this is we have not consolidated all the data in a database. We are just compiling anecdotal evidence in this regard, and in the report that is available online, our attendees can find several examples in this regard.
But indeed, I guess it's an area where we could envisage further action, because I think also for the tracking of the Globe Status Report, this was gradually built up, and I think we just see the need for just more push in this direction. I would also like to, before I give you the floor back, Irena, to make your addition, I would like to mention that the Clean Energy Solution Center and Power Africa have commissioned a report that was launched earlier this year, which is called the Blueprint Guide for Creating Gender-Sensitive Energy Policies, that focused on Western Africa, and that definitely provides some insights in what is needed to streamline gender in energy policies. Anna, you want to add something?
Yes, actually, I want to basically echo what you asked in the question. I think it's data is indeed fundamental if we want to inform decision makers. But at Renewable, when we started producing the Renewables Global States Report, it was really about making the invisible visible. Renewable energy was not reflected in energy statistics. The information and data had to be built up to then be able to say, like, things are happening here, they need to be taken seriously and inform policy decisions, but also investment, etc. And I think this is really something which is an ongoing process to build information up like this. But consolidating information on the role of women in the energy transition is fundamental to then also create the right policy frameworks, but also better understand where, because often we speak about the transition being important, an important opportunity, or renewable energy being an important opportunity for women. I would argue that considering the transformation which is needed, women are also an opportunity for the energy transition, and I think that's really something which is ideally underpinned by data and evidence.
Indeed. A question to Celia. Was the Irena survey distributed in multiple languages? For example, when looking for global gender disaggregated data in renewable energy, South America is often not very well represented. Perhaps there are other challenges or barriers that are country-specific outside of language.
It's more than just a language issue. Our previous survey, we also distributed it in different languages. It was English, Spanish, French, Arabic, and Chinese. The new survey we have limited to just Spanish, English, and Chinese because the bigger markets are already concentrated in regions that speak those languages anyway, and for a time constraint, unfortunately. But yes, definitely the barriers are way beyond just languages. As I mentioned, the cultural and social norms are the main barrier that still is lagging the role of women and the voice of women in the renewable energy sector. But I think we can make it as a general in general in the broader economy sector, and that's why it's crucial to us again, like as Rana was mentioning in her presentation, to use the policies and regulations to change the perceptions of of the gender roles of what women can do or should do, or the boundaries and the responsibilities that women should have just because of being women.
Thank you very much, Celia. A question, a very specific question. I don't know whether anybody wants to answer this. How do you judge the efforts made in Tunisia to promote the role of women in renewable energy? So concretely, a question about situation, women empowerment situation in Tunisia. Anybody wants to have a go? Okay, if this is not the case, I can maybe yeah, Celia, you want to go ahead?
I wanted to ask, I did not understand properly, Tunisia or Indonesia?
Tunisia, in the MENA region. Tunisia. So I think this, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying that I don't know exactly what is the main measures that the question entails, but Tunisia in general, I think in renewable energy is boosting and making renewables game-changing, especially in solar energy with auctions and tendering, and I think the local content requirements in these auctions is also something that could benefit let's say the development of the communities in the region. But I'm afraid I'm not exactly knowing what measures is the question including.
Yes, thank you. I can just maybe add on this because GWNET is just in the process of launching a mentoring program in cooperation with the German Energy Corporation, which is focusing on women working in the energy sector in 4 MENA countries: Algeria, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia. We're just about to start this program, and I think there is general awareness that women play an important role in the sector, as Celia has pointed out. The sector is thriving, and this mentoring program will be one out of many measures where also I think GIZ looks into women empowerment as part of their bilateral programs. A question here: does the panel think qualitative data are also important in convincing policymakers about women's contribution to the energy sector? If yes, what type of data? Yeah. Anybody wants to have a go on the importance of qualitative data? So not only quantitative, but also qualitative.
Yes, happy to take this. I think quantitative data is a basis, but obviously it is important to assess or to put them in context and to develop the story around the hard facts. And we see today that contrary to the start, for instance, in the energy transition, when it came to clearly having, let's say, installed capacities, or a country does have a target or not, today the renewable energy markets become much more complex also, or more complex, and that there is a need for qualitative analysis, which is really assessing on what is happening in the region, what is happening in the country, what are drivers, and here qualitative analysis is needed. So I would say, like, it's always a bridging between exemplary case studies, the hard facts, and then weaving these together to tell a real story.
I agree. I think both quantitative and qualitative data has to complement each other. We cannot just say a number and leave it out there. We have to also take into consideration the analysis of the behaviors and the social aspect that the qualitative data can provide as well, and complement quantitative data.
Thank you.
Again, they are crucial.
Thank you. A question to Minoru. You mentioned that there are still quite a number of women not having access to clean cooking facilities, and that this area is really moving very slowly. What can we do to speed up development in the field of clean cooking and thereby facilitate the reaching of SDG 7?
I think this area is an area that you don't need a lot of money, but you need a lot of sort of, on the willingness to address. So first, I think the politician would have to put this one at higher on the political agenda. So we have a full backing and commitment of the government. And to do that, this is where the previous question also sort of addresses, is that when you put things in only the hardcore numbers, sometimes these issues may look sort of smaller compared with other bigger issues. But I think if you look at the social and economic implications, this is such a large issue. So somebody would have to come with a convincing argument and then put this one always on the table so people do not forget, particularly at the decision-making processes. So this is the first thing that we have to do. And then I think the voices of civil societies are going to be extremely important here across the world. At international policy making, this is also one of the things that everybody talk about, but we have forgotten to respond. So only about the last 2 years, we started sort of seeing the resurgence of, more voices and more sort of intervention to come. And I think we have got a lot more sort of, work to do to make sure we are going to actually, scale up our interventions over the next 10 years.
Thank you very much, Minoru. An energy transition question. Next, in the absence of long-duration storage solutions and with growing global energy demand, what will serve as a stable backload in a 100% renewable world? Maybe you want to start, Rana?
Yes, I'm happy to start. So it's very clear that so today we're moving from the idea of having a baseload energy system to something which is not fundamentally separated in base and peak load. When we're looking at renewable energy, obviously the starting point is different because you have, especially from solar PV and wind, the electricity which is generated when there is sun and when there is wind, and which is not generated in the situations where there is no sun or wind. And this does require flexibility options, but these flexibility options are not only storage solutions. There are many more. There are also renewable energy. When we're talking about 100% renewable energy scenarios, for instance, there are renewable energy energies which can be steered, so where the generation can be put on and off, basically, which brings a flexibility. Interconnection of the grids bring a huge flexibility. We see, for instance, that in some regions, basically, the wind production between north and south is going to complement each other. There are flexibility options which are linked within the grid, so the way we are operating the transmission grids. Obviously, everything which is linking also to demand side management brings this in. And then it is very clear that hydropower, and this is obviously also linked to storage partly when we're looking at pump storage, can complement to basically complement these peaks. So I think what is still clear there, we're not in the logic of having a base load which should complement solar PV and wind production, but we're looking at an overall energy system which is just being operated in a much more flexible way. What is important here is that the market conditions, again, and that's the regulator frameworks, do also build in new ways of flexibility, which can occur on the generation side, but also on the demand side. And the other development, so storage does play a role when we're talking about very high shares of variable renewable electricity in the grids. So development of storage is fundamental in this case. And here we it's important to also look into the whole flexibility and thermal storage, so the whole sector integration, and not only battery storage, but as I said, pump storage, thermal storage, and batteries in electric vehicles, for instance, etc.
Thank you very much. A question to Celia and Rana. What can we women do in our day-to-day life, in our jobs, in order to increase the awareness about gender inequalities and the role of women in the energy sector? What do you think are our main strengths as women to foster this conversation?
Well, I think one thing that is very important, and that, for example, GWNET, I think we're excelling at, is promoting and helping women to connect with each other, with other women, in particularly in the renewable energy sector, or in the sector that it applies. I think one of the important features that we should all as women do is support each other, which I think the word sisterhood could summarize it. So at the basis, I would say that mentoring and networking among us can make a big difference.
Maybe to complement this, I think in our day-to-day work already start about the fact that we do have a view and a situation which might be different between the norm which we still see in the energy sector. And not only in the energy sector, to be honest, it's in the whole economic sector. The other part is, I feel, especially when we're looking, and this is where it comes down. So here at Renton One, we do have many interns, for instance, and the feedback we have, I think Renton One has been under female leadership since a couple of years. The feedback we have from these interns is that they are very much inspired by having basically female managers, and also it gives them, they can picture themselves in other roles. And I think this is something which is really fundamental, that we need to invest and raise the awareness when we're talking about, so education is important, but inspiration is important here. And especially for future decision makers and future managers. The other part is, I think, not being shy about the fact that there are things we approach in a different way. On the contrary, really underline how this is also of value to bring in a different perspective. I think historically there has been a real disconnect with regard to this, where women felt that they had to behave like men by taking on manager positions. I think luckily we're moving in another space today, and especially in the energy transition, where we're talking about really a transformation of an energy system from something centralized to decentralized, where it's about collaborative approaches, where citizens' involvement plays a role, where we're talking about many different various energy sources. I think women have a real role to play to also bring in another view, and the capacity is often to bridge also between different players. So I think it's have the courage to be proud of what we can bring, even if it's different.
Thank you. I would just like to add a comment from one of the speakers to the previous answer about the role of storage. The person says that she was surprised not to hear about concentrated solar power technology while talking about electricity flexibility. I don't think that Rana wants to exclude this as a solution. She mentioned hydropower, she mentioned biomass, and I think, of course, CSP is also playing in certain parts of the world an important role in when balancing the system. So just to add this, and another question from for maybe Minoru. How can we raise the awareness of key institutional players in the sector on linking energy with gender issues. Any suggestions?
I would say there is a general awareness, but I think where things are lacking is implementation. So implementation means translating awareness into specific sort of policies, specific programs, or specific outcomes that we want. So I think here we need both two approaches, from the top down and the bottom up. I think top down is that clearly that by having a stronger norm framework, such as sort of recommended targets, and based on the gender parity principles, but also voices coming from the bottom, a bottom-up approach of pushing the leadership to adopt to or hire to, those sort of principles. I think both approaches are going to be needed. At the international level, I think really that key is not so much about awareness, really about making sure that those things are translated into specific policy measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minoru. And the last question that I would pose to the entire panel about what gender equality and inclusion policies or programs for both men and women have worked well or are deemed successful in your own companies to therefore improve the quotas and share of, in our case, women. Any suggestions to this question as a final statement?
Well, I think as we could find in our report, all the flexible measures in terms of schedules, flexi time, working from home, that has enabled the participation of women quite greatly across the world. I'm not going to talk particularly in Irena, because I think Irena has already almost a 50% of men and women. So for the time being, we have not needed to say, let's say, policies to be implemented to increase the number of women participating. But in the general overview, I think those measures in terms of making the working environment easier for in terms of schedules have been quite successful. And I think now that's something that across the world is also happening, and this is changing the way that the gender roles are perceived, is helping to change, is enabling parental leave both for mothers and fathers, not only maternity leave, also paternity leave, paid paternity leave. I think it's a measure that is also being very successful to help women be included in the workforce at any sector, not just in renewable energy or in the energy broader sector.
So maybe from Renton one side, we're in the inverse situation. We had for a while only women here working in the secretariat. We now have 2 men, and building on this, I think it's something which is actually so very good to have this, to have basically different views represented. I think when it comes to region, but also gender. What I think, and that's more internationally, and to build on what Celia said, I think Finland has been extremely successful in setting a new norm, and this is, for instance, by making the parental leave. There was a policy to extend the parental leave, provided both parents, it was split between both parents half and half. And I think this is really something which is very interesting as a rule, because it's also important when we're speaking about this gender transition. There is obviously an opportunity for women to enter space, but there is also an opportunity for men to enter space, which is the household and taking care of the kids and having much more active role in their education too. And I think it's something which can be addressed by such policies.
And I'm happy to add on this that it's not only Finland, but also my home country, Austria, that has this system that when parental leave is split between the father and the mother, then it is extended. So I think that this is an approach that is happening in more and more countries. And clearly it shows that, yes, it's important to look at gender issues in the energy sector, but we also need to look at the broader setup, policy setup when it comes to fostering gender equality in society in general. Any further statement, Minoru, from your side?
I think SDGs up to 2030 provide a clear framework to push energy agenda in a way to support gender equality. So I think everybody who are in the sort of, in the positions to lead, this is a time to show that leadership. But also at the same time, we need to continue to sort of hold people accountable and ourselves accountable moving forward. So this is where specific sort of data, specific information is going to be very useful moving forward. So we can keep sort of reminding people how much we have to do more. And also we can keep demanding them and demanding ourselves that we have to continue to work harder. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you very much, Minoru, and thanks to all three panelists for joining us today on this webinar about energy transition and the role of women. I think it was an inspiring discussion and very informative presentations. I invite you and remind you that this is part of a webinar series, and the next webinar will take place in November and will focus on renewable energy job opportunities along the value chain. And be at the lookout for the announcement of this webinar to come soon with, again, very interesting speakers. I think that we now have a short survey for those of you who are still with us to fill, which helps us, of course, to improve quality of these webinars. I hand back to my colleague Vicky for this, and thank you very much for your attention, your questions, and your interest, and your active participation in this webinar.
Thank you, Christine, and also thank you again to Rana, Celia, and Minoru for their outstanding presentations. It is really an honor to have such an esteemed panel of presenters sharing your knowledge, expertise, and we very much appreciate your time. And again, just to reiterate Christine's remarks, we very much appreciate all of those of you who have taken the time to attend today's webinar. With that, we will conclude the webinar, but do stay on the line just for a couple of moments to take our short survey. And with that, this concludes the webinar. Thank you.